All right, y'all, welcome back to the show. It's Anti-War Radio. I'm Scott Horton, and our last guest on the show today is Daniel Ellsberg. He heroically liberated the Pentagon Papers and delivered them to the New York Times and the Washington Post and others back in the 1970s, and is now known as the most dangerous man in America. That's the name of the documentary, and it's actually playing again tonight on PBS. Isn't that right, Dan? Welcome to the show.
Glad to be back, Scott.
And that's right, that tonight on PBS they're replaying The Most Dangerous Man in America, the documentary about you.
Yeah, they're redoing it. The 40th anniversary of the Pentagon Papers, of course, is coming up on June 13th. Interestingly, the first of several trials under Barack Obama of people facing the same charge that I faced 40 years ago is occurring with Thomas Drake's trial scheduled for June 13th, which is the exact 40th anniversary of the beginning of the publication of the Pentagon Papers. So Barack Obama apparently is trying to close the circle there and to commemorate that occasion by this new prosecution.
What a disgrace. All right, well, listen, I was able to listen in on the conference call with the journalists that you and Julian Assange, Jocelyn Raddick, and others did this morning, and you made the case in your opening statement, and then in a follow-up when a question was asked of you, that it is not at all clear that if we assume that the narrative is correct about the actions of Bradley Manning as portrayed by the government, that he's the one who downloaded these documents and or uploaded them to WikiLeaks, etc., like in the story, that if we assume that's true, I think you were saying it is not at all clear that the Espionage Act applies or that he's actually done anything except maybe I think you were saying break his secrecy agreement, his contract with the government maybe, but not any real federal laws. Is that right?
That's true. If he's done the act of, then it would be clear that he's violated various Army regulations, which is pretty easy to do. You know, if you violate any lawful order by a superior officer or any regulation, you're committing a crime if you're in the military. That's not true of a civilian. The president can't make crimes. He can't legislate crimes that apply to civilians. But in his capacity as commander-in-chief, in effect, he can give orders that do have the effect of crimes for anybody in the military, such as Bradley Manning. That wouldn't be true for Thomas Drake, for example.
Well, so I'm interested in that. I mean, what exactly, I guess, I don't really know. What does the Espionage Act say? If this isn't, is there no law that says that?
The Espionage Act was originally passed in 1917, just at the outbreak of our entry into the First World War, and was not intended to be an official secrets act. How do we know that? Because the legislative history, meaning the discussion in Congress of the pros and cons of the act, led to the expression by a number of the people, even those who favored the act, that it was not the intention to do what and by name, the Official Secrets Act in Britain actually did, which was to criminalize any and all disclosures of information that the government was protecting or was trying to hold close, without any question of intent to serve the public interest or the possible benefits to the public that might come from this, or the fact that the information involved might involve government embarrassment because of criminality by the government or deception or recklessness. An act like the British Act, which President Wilson would have liked to see, like some of his successors would have liked to see, was rejected by Congress. They said that's in violation of the First Amendment, so it's unconstitutional in this country. And moreover, the judgment was the framers of the Constitution were right on this point. The First Amendment is a good idea and deserves being observed here, because the alternative is that we have only the information about the government workings that the officials want us to have or allow us to have, and that negates the very idea of democracy, of accountability, of public sovereignty, of any ability really even to know what the policies are, let alone to influence them. So whereas officials in any government, in the executive branch, could live very comfortably without democracy and accountability. Let me be more precise. They would prefer that. They would be happier, and that's as true in this country as any other country, even though some of them do recognize that there are benefits, even for themselves as officials, but also as citizens, to be living in a democracy. Nevertheless, they'd be happy to get out of the position of having anyone second-guess their decisions or hold them accountable in any way. No one wants to be blamed. No human wants to be blamed for errors or mistakes or crimes or lies if they can get away with it. And that's as true in this country as in any other country. Well, they therefore intended to criminalize essentially secret revelation of defense information to an enemy, especially in times of wartime. And neither I nor anybody else I know objects to the idea of criminalizing such secret transfers of information, in contrast to the revealing to the public openly what the public needs to know about what's happening in the government. Well, for over 50 years after the passage of that act, which was also amended in 1950, but for 50 years after 1917, until my case in 1971, the act was used only as it was intended, against spies. And of course, it continues to be used in that purpose a lot, actually. And certainly, I have no objection to that. I don't think I know, for example, that Julian Assange and I'm sure Bradley Manning or others do not object to the existence of that act, even though it can be said to be a restriction of free speech to some extent, but a restriction that Congress has regarded as acceptable. Even though the First Amendment says Congress shall pass no law, Congress has in fact passed several narrow laws which are, in effect, abridgments of freedom of speech, but which are regarded as acceptable ones in the eyes of Congress and thenceforth by the Supreme Court. And those involve information about nuclear weapons design, about our communications intelligence activities, our interception of foreign coded communications, the revelation of names of our clandestine agents. These are, in effect, small official secrets act. They're not all that small, but they're relative to the whole body of classified information. They're very small, and the Supreme Court has held that those are acceptable in the light of the First Amendment. But up until my case, really, and the few cases since then, it's always been accepted that any act like the British one that would cover any communications that the president, that the officials have marked confidential or secret or top secret, that to forbid that from being told to the public would be far too broad a restriction of freedom of speech to be acceptable under the First Amendment or under the requirements of democracy. In other words, the First Amendment should be upheld in this case. And apparently that presumption of unconstitutionality of the use of the law in that context against disclosures has kept there from being more than 3 prosecutions altogether prior to a Barack Obama. Mine was the first. There was one 10 years later against Samuel Loring Morrison, the only person to be held guilty under that law by a jury. And his case was not reviewed by the Supreme Court. So they've never addressed the constitutionality of the act that was used against me or him or now Bradley Manning. There was one third case against the APAC officials and the guy who gave them.
That one cut the
Franklin
other way,
gave it to him. That was dropped by Obama.
All right, we have to hold it right there, Dan, and take this break. Everybody, it's Daniel Ellsberg. He liberated the Pentagon Papers. He wrote the book Secrets, a memoir of Vietnam and the Pentagon Papers. And the documentary is tonight on PBS, The Most Dangerous Man in America. We're talking about Manning and Assange. All right, y'all, it's Anti-War Radio. I'm Scott Horton. I'm talking with Daniel Ellsberg. It was Richard Nixon that called you the most dangerous man in America, right?
It was Henry Kissinger, actually.
Oh, Henry Kissinger, even better. That's quite a laurel to rest on there, but you never have. And it's great that you're out here defending Bradley Manning, who really needs defending. And I want to get right to what you're talking about here, the heart of the matter as far as the Espionage Act, between, being a spy or being a journalist or someone who supplies a journalist with information with high motives, such as informing the American people of things that are either criminal or at least bad policy, that kind of thing. And I was wondering if you could explain a little bit more about how the difference is defined in the law. Jocelyn Raddick, in the conference call this morning, talked about the Military Whistleblower Protection Act, and I think, Dan, you've told me before, you're a former Marine Corps officer, right? And told me that you or your men in the Marine Corps, you were mandated, if the chain of command was broken, you were mandated to go over his head in whatever way you had to report criminal activity, right?
Well, in theory, yes. And that's what you should do. There's no question that giving information, whether to outsiders or to people higher up in the chain of command, is done at risk administratively to your career, to your relation with your bosses. If it's something your immediate boss doesn't want told and you tell it to anyone, you're taking a risk of your job, your career, your reputation, no way around it. The question is, do we want to see added to that risk of sanctions, which inhibit far too many people, which keep far too many secrets that ought to be told? Do we want to add the sanction of criminal prosecution and possibility of prison? And prior to Barack Obama, although the threat has always been there, it's posed to everybody who signs a secrecy agreement that they might be subject to prosecution under the Espionage Act. When I signed that, I was not aware that no one had ever been prosecuted up till that time. And even after me, only 2 prosecutions were brought. That is changing right now under Obama. And if he succeeds in these convictions, and if he gets 1 out of the 5 or 4 that are still pending here, and more to come, it seems, against Assange, and if those are upheld by the Supreme Court, the law will have changed in a way that very few journalists are foreseeing or are aware, members of the public. We're in a crisis, in other words, of public information, which is not appreciated by very many people at all. And that's why I'm glad you're asking these questions, Scott, and why I'm going on at such length about them. If that changes, our relation to the government, our ability to act as a democratic public in a democracy will have been very greatly constrained. And I have to say, that's likely to happen. Whatever we do, it's likely to happen, and that's why I think it's incumbent on us to really inform ourselves and to start getting very politically active to increase the chance that we will be able to hold our government accountable for its policies.
Mm-hmm. Now, do I have you right that these various whistleblowers from the NSA and other agencies, I think you say there are 5 other cases going on now, they're all being prosecuted under the Espionage Act or different things?
Yeah, they all include that. In some cases, there are other charges as well.
Uh-huh.
For example, if they lose on the Espionage Act, which is part of the Bradley Manning case as well, and of all the others, they will fall back on theft charges and conspiracy charges, which were involved in several of these, and they'll try to find other ways to keep us from knowing what they're doing, which exists. But so far, they're depending in particular on this Espionage Act clause. Keep in mind, they're not charging spying. They're not really saying that we and these other people are spies. They're saying that these clauses of the Act do apply. And if that is taken, if that's upheld by the Supreme Court, then you really have to look hard at what the wording of that Act says, because it makes it very clear that if you, Scott, you're a journalist, but let's say you don't have to be a journalist. A reader of the New York Times who is warned that the article contains classified information, which happens every other day or so. Not all his documents, by the way. It just says so-and-so has been granted anonymity because he's discussing classified information. The reader is thereby put on warning. If the reader fails, this sounds absurd, but this is the wording of the Act. If the reader fails to return that information to the proper authorities, if he retains it by not throwing out the New York Times, let's say, if he hands it, or she hands it, to his spouse or to a child, or allows them to download it on their computer, he's guilty of part of the conspiracy of doing this. And you can say, well, surely they wouldn't apply it to all these people. Actually, interestingly, the State Department and others, the Air Force, have warned people if they download classified information from WikiLeaks from the New York Times onto their home computers, if their families do it, they are in danger of losing their clearance, of not getting a clearance if they might apply for one in the future. That means of losing a career of this sort that requires it. And it so happens the Act says, but they don't want to spell it out for fear of looking a little too intimidating, they're actually subject to prosecution under this interpretation.
Well,
and
so,
to think that
Dan,
will never happen, I think, is unwise.
I mean, it sounds like, to say that, this is the most whistleblower prosecutions of any presidency and that kind of thing, as you have said, as others have said, all that's true, but the real point is this is kind of a real revolution in the exercise of power at the Department of Justice. This is not the kind of thing they've done. Now they're doing 5 of them.
The point very well that this is part of a two-pronged policy by both the George W. Bush and the earlier to some extent the Clinton, but in particular the George W. Bush and the Obama administrations. In this respect of public information or homeland security, national security, civil liberties in general, I think it's inescapable to say that we have here the third term of George W. Bush administration in these respects, if not worse, despite the fact that the president campaigned against his Republicans in part on the grounds that they had abused their powers and that these were excessive and unconstitutional actions. He said in a number of respects it would be unconstitutional and illegal, we're moving here a little bit, to attack a country that had not attacked us, and then, of course, proceeds to do it in Libya. Well, in these respects as well, he had said that whistleblowers are courageous, are necessary to our form of government, which is just true, actually, and then, of course, has acted unprecedentedly against whistleblowers. Now, what's going on? And as Greenwald points out, in both these administrations, but very much this one, there's action both to increase the privacy of government affairs from the public, from voters, from the press, from anyone who might hold them accountable, the opacity, you might say, to reduce the transparency of government to the supposedly sovereign public, on the one hand. And on the other hand, increasing the transparency of everyone else's private affairs, the ability to listen in on them, to monitor their emails and their faxes, all their electronic communications, and to make them subject to blackmail by the authorities who read and retain all this material. So it's to make, just to reverse the intention of the First Amendment or of our form of government, which is to have a government that is transparent to its electorate, who in turn are safe from intrusions on their privacy and safe from manipulation by the government. Both Bush and Obama, and one can say all administrations since 9/11 that's these two, have taken advantage of that excuse to reverse those priorities and to greatly increase the ability of the government to act arbitrarily and unilaterally without even the knowledge, let alone the influence of the public.
All right, now, since before the Iraq War, you've been urging people inside the government to liberate documents that prove truths that the American people, or at least reveal truths that the American people need to know. And then really it's just, I guess in about half the time since I've been talking to you, Dan, the WikiLeaks have been invented. And I was just thinking, this is really your dream come true, right? I wanted to give you a chance to call out to the whistleblowers. They don't have to all get on a chat log with Adrian Lamo, the rat. They could just upload and then keep their mouth shut and get away with it, right?
So far, as Assange just said this morning to the press, none of their sources, without revealing herself or himself, has actually been discovered. Their methodology, their software and whatnot, has apparently enabled anonymity from the NSA more than I would have expected. When I was asked years ago to be an advisor to them, I really couldn't take it seriously. I thought, surely NSA will be on top of all this, the National Security Agency, or the FBI, and they'll be able to really to penetrate everything that's being said and done. Apparently that's not true, and the only way we'll have real knowledge of what the government is doing of the sort that might embarrass them and might lead to a change in office or a change in policy, the very things our form of government are supposed to ensure. The only way to do that is by going to WikiLeaks or some comparable approach. The papers themselves can imitate that technology, I would hope, and use it to get the information that otherwise they simply will be forced to reveal their sources and open themselves to prosecution.
All right, everybody, that's Daniel Ellsberg, liberator of the Pentagon Papers, author of the book Secrets, a Memoir of Vietnam and the Pentagon Papers. And at the publisher's website, if you just Google around and look closely, you'll see a link to the entire Chapter 1, his first day on the job, the day of the Gulf of Tonkin non-incident. It's an incredible read, and will certainly convince you to read the rest of the book. His website is ellsberg.net. You can follow him on Twitter, and you can thank whichever Lord you believe in that he's out there sticking up for Bradley Manning and for WikiLeaks and free speech and liberty in general. Thanks very much, Dan, for your time on the show today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for doing the same, Scott. You're doing a wonderful job.
Well, thanks very much. I appreciate that.